Yama, thank you for marking Aboriginal Sunday. Our prayer is that you will be inspired and equipped today to continue the journey of walking alongside Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, to deeply listen and be transformed and empowered to take action for justice. In this video, Safina Stewart and myself will be guiding you through an Aboriginal Sunday reflection based on the theme Defiant Hope. And throughout the video, you will also hear from a range of voices of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Christian leaders.
One of the grounding pieces of imagery that we will return to is the Southern Cross. The constellation of the Southern Cross has been a faithful guide for our people whenever someone is navigating at night, whether on land or sea. When people need to know which way to follow, or maybe they've been lost, if they know how to read the Southern Cross, it helps them to find their way. Can you see that the wounds of Christ are marked in the Southern Cross in the sky above Australia? The crown of thorns, nails in his hands, in his feet, the spear in his side. Well, for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Christians, this has been a reminder of who we put our trust in, who we put our faith in. We know that Jesus knows our people's pain. Jesus knows our land's pain, and yet through his sacrifice, he has given us hope, direction, and possibility for the future.
Well, first of all, I would like to thank Amanda very much for giving me this opportunity to share a few thoughts with you this morning on a topic which is close to my heart. Today, we are joining with an organisation called Common Grace and churches around Australia to mark Aboriginal Sunday, the Sunday before January 26. We are responding to a request made in 1939 by an Aboriginal Christian leader named William Cooper, a Yorta Yorta man. He invited Christians of all denominations to go deeper on the journey of listening, learning, and supporting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in their ongoing struggle for reconciliation and justice. So our first question this morning would have to be, are Aboriginal people still struggling for reconciliation and justice? Do they still need or even want us to be listening, learning and supporting? Well, I think most of us would know that there does exist still a huge gap in the health statistics, living conditions and educational opportunities between Indigenous people and the average non-Indigenous Aussie. There is also evidence of considerable transgenerational pain in many communities, sometimes known as inherited trauma, which can lead to repetitive patterns of destructive behaviour and is perhaps a reason for another problem, their over-representation in our prison systems. Some of us know too that the result of the referendum last year left many of the current leaders depressed and despairing. So I think it would be true to say that there is still an unhealed wound at the heart of our nation and that we are still on a journey towards a meaningful reconciliation with our First Nations people. So the second question is, how did this all come about? How did we get to this place? And I would like to begin with a brief summary of the historical facts as we now understand them, and suggest that we approach this story with compassion rather than blame. And I mean compassion for the early settlers as well as for the Aboriginal people. Because it seems to me that sadly, a tragedy was inevitable. From the moment the new arrivals began to build on land which they assumed was theirs for the taking. They believed it belonged to the British government from the moment Captain Cook planted his flag. And the British government had given it to them because it was terra nullius. Nobody owned it. Nobody else cared about it. Unfortunately, none of those early settlers, convicts, soldiers, or government officials could have had any comprehension of the strong spiritual bond the natives had with their country, or any understanding of the way this bond undergirded their whole way of life, their identity, their spirituality, their kinship systems, and their culture. Consequently, they had no idea either of the devastating social disintegration which would occur following the loss of that land. How could they have? Their main task was to build a permanent settlement, plant crops, and dig in for the future. And sadly again, as they took control of more and more land, there was never any talk of negotiation or a treaty or meaningful recompense. Why would you do that when you knew that black people in general were essentially inferior? And the ones we had here were particularly primitive, virtually subhuman, as they were described, because they didn't feel pain like white people. And in any case, they were destined to die out. So there's just a little group of Aborigines not feeling any pain. But in my opinion, there is no point in blaming or condemning our ancestors who were behaving according to their own social conditioning. But we do need to recognise that as a result of all that then followed, there is unfinished business in our country. Why? Because the black people did not die out. They were, in fact, a very spiritual people with a deeply innate and indomitable spirit, and this enabled a few of them to survive, despite the initial spasmodic attacks to clear them off their traditional countries, and then the intentional massacres, which are now being called frontier wars. Despite also the forcible removal of children from their families between 1910 and the 1970s. The report from the 1997 National Inquiry into this program concluded that it was actually an act of genocide, contrary to the United Nations Convention on Genocide, which was ratified by Australia in 1949, right in the middle of the period when the children were being taken away. But you might say, genocide? Yes, because without any kind of court order, the majority of these children were completely separated from their families and communities. They were taught that Indigenous culture was of no value, and they were forbidden to utter a word of their own language. Many of them were told they were unwanted by their parents, or that their parents were dead, which was not true. Just a little happy group of stolen children. Mind you, they were not all unhappy. Many of them were put into foster homes and treated very kindly by some families, but it was mainly the ones who were put into the government and, unfortunately, sometimes church institutions who seem to be subject to this, what they're calling inherited trauma. So, given all that we've just heard, is it any wonder then that in 1938, this activist by the name of William Cooper, who had been greatly influenced by a missionary named Daniel Matthews, who did not believe that Aborigines or black people were inferior, William Cooper declared a day of mourning, a national day of mourning, and asked the Christian churches to support him, lift his people up. In 1938, he also organised a petition directly to King George V, seeking representation for Aborigines in Parliament, the right to vote, and land rights. Is this familiar? In this, he was way ahead of his time. He was virtually asking for a voice. Another of his basic contentions was that Aboriginal people should have some control over their own affairs. Unfortunately, the Commonwealth Government formally refused to forward the petition to the King and basically ignored all Cooper's appeals for democratic change, which he made consistently throughout the rest of his life. He became very discouraged, but throughout his life maintained a defiant hope, which he never gave up. And we can rejoice that by the grace of God, there is a happy ending to his story, as his tireless work over many years was recognised in June 2018, not all that long ago, when the Australian Electoral Commission announced that the electorate of Batman in central Melbourne would be renamed Cooper. John Batman had been one of the founders of Melbourne. He's the one who said, this is the place for a village. But it is now known that before he arrived in Melbourne, he had taken part in several massacres of Aboriginal people in Tasmania. So before moving on to the third and last question, I would just like to say here that I have been trying very hard this morning to present facts without any particular political slant. If I have crossed over that line and you have an issue with anything that I have said, please feel free to chat over morning tea. But now to our third question. What could we do if we did want to stand alongside our Aboriginal neighbours and support their ongoing quest for justice today? We can't return the land or in our own strength heal the spiritual wounding caused by its loss. But you will find some ideas on your bookmarks, and I will suggest a few more. First, I think it always helps to be as fully informed as possible about anything that we regard as important. And in this case, we're talking about the facts of our history, painful though they may be. Another word for that process is truth-telling. Second, we could support Indigenous Australians by asking what is it that they actually want, and then listening with respect. Third, we can learn about and cooperate with like-minded groups, for example, Common Grace, ANTAR, Australians for Native Title and Reconciliation, Nungalinga College in Darwin, an ecumenical training Bible college for Aboriginal people from all over Australia, or Reconciliation Australia. Fourth, Now, on the political level, we could lobby governments of every colour or stripe to continue the process of public apology to victims of gross violations of human rights and humanitarian law. There are many examples of other countries in the world apologising for morally questionable actions of their own previous governments. We could also ask for the recommendations of government reports to be implemented, which hasn't happened very much by any government. We did have one example of this with Kevin Rudd's apology to the stolen generations in 2008. But there it stopped, there it finished. Fifth, we need to remember that the ugly face of racism contributed to many Aboriginal deaths and to the massacres which are now being investigated by a team from Newcastle University and referred to as Frontier Wars. And this is their most recent map. The yellow dots represent massacres. The definition of a massacre is that it has to be intentional and planned, carried out in secret, and be responsible for the deaths of a group of at least 6 people. There are a few little bluey-green squares on that map. They represent counterattacks that Aboriginal people made at various stages after something had happened, like a massacre or taking a land where they were very used to harvesting whatever was the crop, whatever that land produced. When they got really, really upset, they sometimes they did fight back. But of course they were never successful on the military level because, as Al Grasby used to say, they didn't have any tanks. I was shocked when I saw that map, really shocked. 6, there might be those who might want to make some kind of financial restitution to pay the rent, so to speak. Donations may be made to any number of Aboriginal organisations, churches or schools. One parish in Melbourne pays a weekly rent to the Wurundjeri Land Council for the land its church occupies. Another regularly supports a Wurundjeri elder, Uncle Norman Terrick, who is training in the area of domestic violence. And that's Uncle Norman on the left-hand end. And some of you might recognise Brooke Prentice, the second from the right. She spoke at a meeting in Canberra this year. She's a Waka Waka woman. And Uncle Norman Terrick, of course, is a Wurundjeri elder. And of course, we can pray. We can pray for ourselves, for God's guidance, as we perhaps begin to think more seriously about these issues, and for our Indigenous neighbours generally. With defiant hope in our hearts, that's the theme for this year's Aboriginal Sunday, we can turn a corner and work towards a makarata, the Aboriginal word for a true reconciliation after a period of separation or conflict. After all, reconciliation is at the heart of the Christian gospel. It is an essential part of being a Christian. Most basic is being reconciled with God, and a natural and necessary consequence of this is seeking reconciliation with others. Finally, in a just, equitable and reconciled Australia, Australia and Torres Strait Islander children will have the same life chances and choices as non-Indigenous children, and the length and quality of a person's life will not be determined by their racial background. We believe, don't we, that all human beings are made in the image of God. Red and yellow, black and white, all are precious in his sight. And so to close on a positive note, let us put our trust and hope in God and embrace the opportunity that we have today to seek peace and justice and to love our neighbour as much as we love ourselves. Amen.